Hi all, can anyone hear me? And please wave, because I can't hear you, unfortunately, but it seems to work. So, hi all together. I'm Stefan. I'm with ARRI, and we produce cameras and lighting for 104 years now. And only a few years ago, we also started to get engaged in the virtual production environment. And today I'm speaking about how to use cameras, of course, ARRI cameras, but mostly this occurs with all cameras, especially cinematic cameras, how to use them in virtual production environments, what artifacts might occur, what problems will you meet, and how, for example, a color pipeline could work. I won't get too far in the last point. I will only point at two directions which might be worthy of a discussion. Let's start with the basics. How do I manually set up a camera for virtual production, and why? Why is easy? Because I want to have a good image. But what do you need? Of course, you need a camera and a lens. Choosing the sensor and the lens type is a pure creative decision. There is no need to go for a certain lens in virtual production environments. Of course, signature primes perform a bit better than other cheaper lenses, but again, it's a purely creative choice. Every camera and every lens that we have and other manufacturers have as well do work in virtual production environments, as long as they have two basic requirements, and that is a way to synchronize them, and of course, some way of metadata exchange. You would need lens data, focus, zoom, and iris, of course, to have a virtual representative in Unreal Engine or Unity or whatever system you're using. Of course, we're using Unreal Engine at the moment because it simply has the most handles and most support for virtual production. And of course, you also can use a camera model that is able to exchange camera metadata to remotely control your camera data, the frame rate you're shooting in. All that is very valuable information for having in the post-production process. Of course, you want to avoid post-production, but it's not possible. You always will have post-production. And also, sort of belonging to the camera, I think, is a tracking device, which is giving you the position of the camera. That you know, you have two possibilities of solving that. There are more, but two are the way to go at the moment. You can have an outside-in tracking system with a passive device on the camera, and have active cameras or other sensors on your stage ceiling and is tracking the camera passively. Or you have an inside-out tracker, which is basically a camera on your hero cam, and it's shooting upwards or in front. Both have their advantages and their disadvantages. The stages I have been working in, at least when they were larger, have used both tracking devices because of having, well, both advantages. If your camera is assembled, you would need to continue in integrating it. And most important is the synchronization of the camera to your LED wall, because if there is a different frame rate, it doesn't work. If the frame rate isn't adjusted properly, like some devices don't provide proper frequencies, they are a bit away from what they actually should deliver, or do have too big, not latency, how's it called? Well, too big headroom, or not precise enough, it doesn't work very good. Just as an example, if it doesn't match properly, you might experience image artifacts that look like those lines here and there. And this could occur because, as specified in the SMPTE standard, the frequency is 24 over 1.001, and this does not match 23.98, as actually the title of this frequency is named. Actually, this must be 23.976. Otherwise, it doesn't work, and you might get artifacts like this. What else is important? Shutter angle adjustment. The shutter angle normally if you're shooting with a cinematic camera is at 180 degrees. But this might result in also having line type image artifacts of a certain kind. So it would be good to manually adjust your shutter angle to a proper value. And this value might be close to 180, but if it is 180, it's only by accident. So what you're doing is you take a very small shutter angle, like 5 degrees, and expose as many artifacts as you want to expose, and manipulate the shutter angle to smaller or bigger values. And eventually you will meet a point here at 5.6 or 5.7 or 5.5, somewhere in that area. Eventually we'll get there where you have minimized the line type artifacts of the LED wall, and in combination with a rolling shutter, of course. There are similar artifacts with a global shutter, but they are only similar, not the same. And then you start to multiply this by a integer multiple, like 2. And then again, do the procedure to minimize artifacts, multiply that again, the procedure, multiply that, adjust, until you are at a value that is close to your aspired shutter angle. That might be 180 degrees that you want to have, but you're resulting in 170.0, for example, or you're shooting at a different angle because you are having a multicam setup, or you are using ghost frame, which is also very difficult to do with rolling shutter cameras in cinematic exposures, because the time slots you have left are very short. It is possible with a wall that has a high enough frequency, but it's harder to achieve than in TV style productions where you have shorter exposure times and of course a global shutter most of the time. What else can result? Well, let's go to the image artifacts. A very popular artifact we are confronted with by our customers and by other people who search for help is ghosting. Ghosting mostly occurs if you have a double exposure, and it usually occurs if you are moving something in front of the LED wall, or if your camera is panning in front of the LED wall or tilting in front of the LED wall. And it occurs more if your LED wall doesn't have the same frequency as the camera. For example, there might be reasons to have the LED wall on 50 Hertz and your camera at 25 frames per second. That's very possible, but don't move too fast in front of that because you will have a double exposure. And this also occurs when it's too dark. So that's the LED wall I'm in front of, and we exposed this LED wall with like, I think 50% of its brightness. And we did a very fast tilt movement. And what you see here is perfect motion blur, but no double exposure. So if you want to have fast movements, have your LED wall at a proper brightness level and you won't run into any problems. Well, and there are other line artifacts that might occur. They have a very different origin, and it strongly depends on the LED wall you're using and the processor type it's running with. For example, many LED processors do have some certain features that enhance low-level performance. It's called dark magic or whatever. And this works sometimes, but not all the time, and you need to turn them off, because otherwise you will have artifacts that look like that. As you can see in the different grayscales, they are differently exposed, and you have those Blocko-type artifacts that result on a manipulation of the PWM. We just heard what PWM is. I think you know that already. So for example, if I have a base frequency of 3,800 Hertz here, and I have a brightness of 0.5 in a linear space, you can see that half of the time the LED is on, the other half of the time the LED is off. If I decrease the brightness to 0.5, you can see the on time is shrinking to a very short amount of time. And if you want to get lower with your brightness, so lower grayscales, it might be the case that the LED processor is starting to get fancy, because it cannot diminish the time anymore. The LED is on. It starts to leave away certain frequencies, and this might not be a problem. But for example, if you're getting to a brightness of a quarter, 4/100, then suddenly you have halved your LED frequency to not 3,800 hertz anymore, but 1,900, and you can keep on with that game. If you get lower, you always diminish the frequency that you're actually shooting on, and this is resulting in those artifacts. Again, this strongly depends on the LED processor and strongly depends on the LED wall you're shooting with. Others perform better, others perform worse than the type I have shown here. Also, some LED walls that are in the, well, not even the low price range, actually in the very high price range, but they are more consumer oriented, do have other line type artifacts because they somehow have a management that is very perfectly made for the eye, but as soon as you point a camera on it, you get line types. You can see in the wood line here that the lower part of the trees is a bit brighter than the higher parts, and this is because the lower part is exposed like 100 times to the LED wall, and the upper part is exposed only like 99 times to the LED. That's almost invisible at higher brightnesses, but if you tune down the LED wall, this artifact becomes clearly visible, and you have 3 times or 4 times exposure in the upper level of the image, and on the lower part of the image you have only 2 or 3 times exposure. So watch out for that, because that can really ruin your image. What else do we have? Well, bending, we have spoken about that. Bending occurs again in low brightness ranges. And actually what you can see here is 2 types of bending. This is the line type artifacts that Roloff showed before. And also what you see in the wood line again, that the colors are very compressed on the LED wall. So you can't display any contrast anymore. I think you're very familiar with this artifact out of other contexts. But it's always visible. It can be visible on the LED wall if it's getting too low and if your contrast isn't adapted to that. What else do we have? Moiré. We have heard of Moiré. It's a very difficult topic because Moiré is dependent on many, many parameters like pixel pitch of the LED wall, position of the camera in correlation to the LED wall. It's the camera pixel size. It's the lens that you're using, its aperture, its focal length, and other parameters that can have an influence on Moiré. And this can be very obvious, as seen in those images here, but it also can be very subtle. And it's quite hard to monitor this on set live. So we are working on a Moiré planner that might actually help people, help producers, help cameramen to evaluate that feature, because sometimes you don't see it until it's too late. And sometimes you can repair it in post-productions, but sometimes not so easy. And it can't be, it can't be removed. Avoid it. It's the only way to be safe. Avoid Moiré on all costs. And then let's talk a bit about color. I think in driving the LED walls, there is a big discussion. Either do I take gamma curve or do I go for the PQ, the perceptual quantizer function? And at the moment we are working on some measurements, what would be the better way? And what you can see here in orange is the perfect gamma function, that's the orange line, and also some measured values from an LED wall. And in blue, it would be the perfect PQ function, but also you can see the implemented PQ function in the LED wall. And it's doing 2 things. One, the first thing, for your higher grayscale levels, you do have some sort of plateau. I'd be careful with that, because this might be the case that we have driven it wrongly. Also, I don't think so. I think we have driven it correctly. And I also think that not all LEDs, not all LED processors show that rather erratic behavior on the top level. And on the low level, what it definitely will do is push more values of your brightness scale to lower levels. And we have seen before, lower levels are those levels where LED walls don't perform so good. And in the end, the PQ function is called perceptual quantizer. It's made for perception, and it will sit there. Imagine not an eye, and therefore the camera doesn't care if it's gamma or PQ. So go for where the LED wall performs better, and that is gamma. And the second point I wanted to point at is, which color space should I use if I'm feeding a signal to the LED wall? Do I use an SDR color space like Rec 709? Do I go for ST24? Do I use P3? Or do I use the native color space of the LED wall? Of course, you won't use 709 except for some special productions, because it won't give you much information, as you can see, compared to the 3 dots, which are indicating the LED native color space. The 3 dots are much bigger than Rec 709. So basically, you would lose information if you put a camera on it. The same is with P3. It's also smaller than what the LEDs actually can deliver today. And if you go for Rec 2020, you are basically in the native color space, because Rec 2020 is bigger than what any LED display at the moment at a reasonable price can deliver now. So our recommendation, or what I would like to state here, is go for a native color space, because the camera is used to film natural environments. The camera doesn't care if the signal that is in front of the LED wall, it simply doesn't care if it's in PQ, if it's in Rec 709, if it's SDR, if it's some other encoded signal. The camera simply receives light from the LED wall. It doesn't receive a color space. And also the LED wall doesn't care basically what's coming on. It simply interprets something and will reproduce any color that's coming in with its own means. That means with its own LED that it has. So everything you're doing is restricting this native color space. And what you're then doing is deliver less information into your world that your camera is living in. So you want to avoid that, because if you have more information, you can have more fun in the end in post-production, in whatever you're doing with your footage. So much for it. I'd be happy to receive any questions.
Hello, Stefan. Yeah, I just heard that finally new Alexa Mini is coming this year. The Alexa Mini Super 35 with 6K sensor. So does it will have the gen lock on board?
The Alexa Mini does have gen lock on board. Yes, of course. And the all our mini series do have gen lock on board. Also, the new camera that is released this year will have gen lock, of course, and they also have a sync shift, which might be important to adjust the phase position of the LED wall. So they come with it. You also can use the larger series, the Alexa and the Alexa LF, but there you have to trick a little bit and using the time code in for synchronization and an audio delay. So that's also possible, but it's a bit inconvenient to use those cameras. All mini models do have the easy way.